Wind lifted sand off the talus and threw it against his cheeks like grit from a blasting cabinet. He had climbed before dawn to a shoulder of the San Andres Mountains, where the white sheet of the Tularosa Basin spread out like salt below, and the range fell away in cliffs and broken benches. A rusted claim post leaned at an angle beside him, its cap punched with a number and a year that meant nothing now. He unfolded a photocopied map, corners soft from sweat, and looked for landmarks a stranger had circled: a dry fall, a notch, a faint cart track. Somewhere out here, the story promised, a Spanish priest had hidden a gold vein and sealed it with stone and silence. The air smelled of creosote and sun-warmed limestone. The only sound was the hiss of sotol blades in the wind and the click of a small pebble as it skipped downhill, as if the mountain were answering with a single word: keep looking. The facts everyone agrees on are simple. Spanish colonists and Franciscan friars moved up the Rio Grande corridor in the 16th and 17th centuries, planting missions near pueblo towns, scouting timber and ore, and filing records that traveled back to governors and crown. Prospectors worked where ore showed: silver, lead, copper, and, in places, gold. The San Andres, a long limestone ridge east of the basin, held small showings of metals and a lot of hard rock. Then came 1680. The Pueblo Revolt drove the colonists out. Mines and prospects were abandoned, tools left in adits, stone altars emptied. When Spain returned years later, settlements concentrated again along water and fields. Prospecting resumed where it made sense, and records scattered across clerks' ledgers and parish rolls. That is where the Lost Padre Mine legend nests, between what the paper trail shows and what the land might still be hiding. Most versions set the mine somewhere high along the San Andres spine, north of the Organ Mountains, west of the Jornada del Muerto, in country as stingy with water as any in New Mexico. Springs show as damp stains by late summer. Limestone cliffs break into shelves you can only cross by sidling and grabbing juniper. A prospector with hand tools could have worked a pocket, walled it up, and left. Time and gravity would finish the cover job. Stories tell of a friar who found a vein while visiting scattered families in the foothills, swore his workers to secrecy, and hid the portal during a raid. Others say a dying priest handed a map to a herder and warned that opening the ground would bring death. Those lines always arrive without names you can cross-check against mission rolls. The 19th century blew new air into the rumor. Prospectors walked the San Andres and the Organs, hammering out assays, filing claims, and building short-lived camps where ore paid and moving on when it didn't. Oro Grande swelled on copper and gold hopes around 1900. Hillsborough and Kingston boomed earlier on real silver. County clerks filled books with metes and bounds, assayers stamped slips with percentages, newspapers printed notes about old Spanish workings rediscovered. Sometimes that meant a shallow pit with oxidized rock or a hand-cut notch in a ledge. In bars and tents, men added a priest to the picture because a priest made any hole feel older and richer. The 20th century added a fence. In 1945, the U.S. Army established White Sands Proving Ground, later White Sands Missile Range, across a vast piece of the basin and the flanks of the San Andres and Oscura ranges. Trails that herders and hunters used for generations ran into warning signs. A rumor that had already been hard to prove now had a barrier that made it sound truer. If you could just get past the gate, people said, you'd find the portal. Researchers writing mining histories had to mark features as on restricted land, which is a scholarly way of saying, we can't go see. The record you can read is a record of persistence and disappointment. Claims bloom and die in cycles that follow commodity prices. Adit mouths bite into the mountain and end in tight rock. Photographs from the early 1900s show men with rock hammers and mules, standing in scrub, the sky big and the mountain indifferent. When someone told a reporter they had found Spanish diggings, the proof on the ground tended to be tool marks with a chisel's rhythm and a pile of weathered tailings. It was evidence of old work, not of a hidden vein worth a conspiracy. The curse part of the legend grew the way curses usually do, out of bad luck retold until it hardens into pattern. This country breaks ankles and overheats people who carry too little water. Trucks wash out in monsoon gullies. A man who pushes for one more ridge in June can be in trouble by 2 in the afternoon. String a half-dozen mishaps across 30 years, tell them at campfires, and soon the mountain sounds like it has a temper. Add a carved cross found near a seep, or a date chiseled in a style that looks old, and the picture sharpens just enough to keep the next search going. There are grains that could be real. A few adits along the San Andres show handwork, not drill and powder. Some cut stones look older than ranch lines. A faint cart track hugs a bench where nobody drives now. A carved cross stands on a ridge that faces no trail. But none of those details tell you what came out of the ground or who ordered the work. Mission records that survive are heavy on baptisms and marriages and light on private errands. If a friar ran a gold pocket on the side, he did it outside policy and paper. Geology leans against the legend without killing it. The San Andres are mostly limestone and dolomite with intrusions and mineralization at breaks. Lead, zinc, and manganese show up, with copper in places. Gold in economic quantity is uncommon. A small pocket, a rich stringer, a placer patch, and a wash. It's all possible without leaving a long tail. A working mine that paid heavy for years would have drawn notice, fights, and receipts once the region fell under American law. No such stack has turned up. What exists is a braid. Spanish presence, later claims, hard country, and people who want the last missing piece to be a priest with a secret. The modern shape of the story rests on absence as much as presence. Restricted land keeps parts of the range quiet. Old families who herded here remember trails now cut by fences. Treasure magazines from the mid-century printed hand-drawn maps with crosses and warnings and sold hope by the page. A few men walked into county courthouses with ore that assayed well enough to keep their own hunt going and swore it came from an opening they would not show until they had capital. That capital never arrived. Search parties keep starting because the country invites it. From the gypsum flats, you can point to breaks in the wall where rockfall hides pockets. On cool mornings in spring, the mountain feels open, as if a day's walk might intersect with someone else's work. Hikers head up with a photocopy of an article, a GPS loaded with pins, and a plan to reach a notch named by a friend of a friend. They find wind, sun, a seep that dries to nothing by August, and an old claim post whose number points to a file that says, abandoned. If the mine existed and was sealed, the desert probably finished the job. Gravity pulls talus down. Frost thaw works cracks wider. Juniper roots pry. A portal once covered by slabs could vanish into a slope that looks like every other slope on this side of the range. That is not a curse. It is what this place does to anything human that is not maintained. The hiker folded his map and looked across a notch to the next arroyo. A dark slot cut the wall in the right place, and for 3 minutes, hope climbed ahead of sense. He side-hilled across crushed limestone and loose scree, reached the slot, and found a shallow prospect with 3 short tool marks and a pile of rock the size of a pickup bed. It was old, and it was nothing. He took a photograph anyway, because that is what you do when a story brings you to a specific patch of ground. He drank the rest of his warm water and headed down before the heat settled flat onto the slope. The value of the Lost Padre legend is less in a bar of metal than in the way it teaches the ground. It makes people read a topo line like a sentence and let a dry wash explain itself. It sends them into county offices to learn how claims were drawn and into archives to see how missions kept time. It reminds them that the desert erases as fast as it reveals, and that some gaps are stubborn enough to make a life's hobby without ever closing. If you ask what is true, here is a map you can trust. Spaniards and friars labored in this corridor for centuries. The San Andres hold scars from old tools and newer ones. The 20th century fenced much of the range. Geology is not generous with gold here, but it is not empty. A priest's name tied to a single rich vein has not surfaced in records that would record it. A dozen small human reasons explain why people keep walking anyway. The thrill of a find, the dignity of a day's search, the way wind sounds in Sotol, and the hope, never quite dead, that a slab will shift under a boot and show a black mouth with old air. By late afternoon, the basin beyond the range looked like a sheet of light, and thermals carried vultures in wide circles over the flats. The hiker reached his truck with dust up to his shins and a single glint in his pocket. A fleck of mica he'd known was mica and had kept anyway. He wrote a note on the back of his photocopy. Old hand cuts. Dry spring. Nothing else. He folded it and slid it into the glove box on top of other notes with other dates. Tomorrow or next season he would try a different arroyo. That too is part of the fact pattern. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.